Hello team, welcome to my training course on using the Microsoft Enterprise Login Application Block. It's been around a long time, it's rock solid, it's performant, it's been used many times by me in different companies I've worked at, and I use it for my personal use. Its primary feature is it separates logging, which you put in code, from the output and the persistence, which is handled in configuration. And it supports a variety of features that let you tailor logging to meet your needs, to write it out to the locations you want it to go to. From a prerequisite standpoint, I'd encourage you to watch the teaser. The little bit of knowledge of Git is helpful. Ability to clone Git repos. You're going to use the Jedi Order repo. We're going to review what you're going to see. We're going to use PowerShell to check out tags. We're going to use TortoiseGit to see the history, and also Git to see the history, so you can kind of get a sense of how we're going to be interacting with the code. Right now I'm thinking this is going to be 7 or 8 different chapters, sections. We're going to start by reviewing a very simple program. We're then going to add a logging method to the program and introduce you to the enterprise application block. We're then going to write the message we've logged out to a location and introduce you to the configuration aspects. And then all the remaining chapters or sections are about some additional features and details. We're going to add additional trace listeners. You'll learn what those are. We're going to work with formatters to configure the output the way you want to see it. Look at some filters. And then some more stuff which I'm not quite sure of right now. What we're not going to be covering is why you should be logging. If you are going to log, I certainly think it's a good idea. Why roll your own? We're not going to be covering why the enterprise application block from the Microsoft Patterns and Practices group versus other frameworks. There's many these days. There's Log4Net, Nlog, and Spring, Serolog. They all broadly do the same thing. They've got pros and cons. You can Google, get a lot of insight, but this one I'm familiar with and certainly willing to share what I know about it. From a dependency standpoint, just a few things, all of which are available on NuGet. We're going to be using Prism to make it a little bit easier to write a very simple application, taking advantage of the commanding features. And then a couple libraries that I've created, one to implement some base functionality for WPF MVVM applications, specifically iNotify property changed. And then VNC.Logging, which is just a way of using the enterprise application block and provide some additional features that you might find handy. So let's get started. So before we start, let's do a quick review of where you can get the code and what you're going to see as we go through the lessons and how you can use the code to follow along. So starting with GitHub, if you go to my repository, CH_Rhodes, and go to the specific repository called Jedi Order, first step is to clone the repository onto your local file system. I've already done that. And so here in a folder somewhere on my machine, I've checked out master, and the code has been created, and then I went back and added tags to help you check out different versions of the code as we progress through the sessions. This is using TortoiseGit to show the tags: start here, 1, start here, 2, first log, 3, first output. And over here in a PowerShell window, this is the output of git log. And as you can see, it's the exact same thing. So did the initial commit, and then we have a variety of tags. And so what we'll be doing throughout this course is we'll be doing git checkout, and let's get started now. 1, start here. And so now what's happened is the code that's in the folder that we just saw. And then what's in this folder is the initial start of the project, which is basically the simple application that we're going to be adding logging to. So as you progress, you'll be checking out the different tags, first log entry, first output, etc. If you go back and look here, you'll see that Git's told you that you've created a detached head. Now, if you want to follow along and make the coding changes yourself, you might want to read the screen here and create some branches, because otherwise Git will clean up the heads that you've detached, and you won't be able to go back to any commits you make. But you certainly can follow along without making coding changes just by checking out subsequent tags. As we just checked out one start here, let's open up the project and see what we've got. Okay, so what we have is a very simple WPF app. It's got very few files. It's using the MVVM pattern, which is really not important, but just a common style. The app XAML file startup URI is set to main XAML. Main XAML is a very simple user interface that consists of 3 buttons. The buttons are bound through commands to code behind in the view model. Some of the output is bound to fields, properties in the view model. The main XAML code behind doesn't do anything other than create the view model and set the data context so the commands and bindings work properly. The main view model has 3 major pieces of code. It's got a constructor section. It's got some fields and properties in the construction. We're just setting up delegate commands to call methods in the code for the 3 buttons that we bound to over here. So binding button 1 command, that's going to call button 1 execute. There are fields implementing iNotify property change. We use a class from VNC Core to implement iNotify property change. So the code here is very simple. All these properties basically do the same thing. And then the methods are very simple. They set the message property to a variety of things so you can see what's going on. And the only thing that you might want to pause here and look at is method 1 calls method 2, calls method 3, calls method 4, calls method 5. This is to kind of give you a sense of, deeply nested calls and how logging might help you understand what's going on, especially if an exception was thrown from a deep method. The only other file to look at, actually 2, there's a file here called comment, and all that does is define a constant, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. And there's also an app config file, which we're not going to talk about yet, but one of the beauties of the enterprise application block is it completely separates the logging in the code from configuration, which has everything to do with writing the log messages out somewhere, or potentially to multiple places. All right, so we've taken a quick look at the code. Let's go see this stunning application in action. Okay, we've talked about the code, how buttons are bound to commands in the view model, and you click a button and you can see it updated the message field. Click a button, updated the message field. Click a button, updates the calculation. And portending the future, let's do some division by 0. Oh my goodness, an exception. So that's what the application does. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go add some logging to it. Okay, we've seen the application in action. Not much to see. Push some buttons, see some messages. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add some logging to the application. We're not going to write it out anywhere. We're just going to add some logging. So we're going to go back to our PowerShell window. We're going to do git checkout to first log entry. And you will notice if we come back into Visual Studio, the only thing that's changed is we've got a new log message. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into the differences between VNC.Logging and the enterprise application block, but let's just scratch the surface, because VNC.Logging is simply a way of using the enterprise application block that simplifies some of the choices you can make and perhaps provide some direction to the developer, which we'll talk more about as we proceed. But just to give you an idea of the differences, let's go add a reference to Microsoft Practices Enterprise Logging and take a look at what the write method can do. So you can see that there are 19 overloads, and the first overload takes a log entry. Hint, log info underneath the covers prepares a log entry from the parameters you pass in and then calls this method. That's really all VNC.Logging does. It does a little bit more, but that's basically it. Now, if you want to use the enterprise application block directly, you can use it directly. I'll show you how to use the configuration to control what you listen for, where you direct the output. All of that behaves identically. There's no differences between VNC.Logging and the enterprise logging. So let's just take a look at some of the overloads. You can take a message. That's pretty obvious. You can take a message in a category. That's basically what VNC.Logging does. The category indicates what category of message this is. Think of it as maybe the name of the class or the application. So common log app is a category. So log info is essentially under the covers preparing a log entry and then calling something like this. It does more than that, but it's equivalent to doing this. And then some others, you can take a collection of categories, you can pass in dictionaries, you can pass in a priority, you can do all sorts of different things. So what you can pass in event IDs, which will show up in the Windows event log. What VNC.Logging attempted to do is save the developer from having to figure out, oh, which overload should I use? So all that complexity is hidden behind log dot, and we'll talk more about the different things that are available in the VNC.Logging method log dot. So that's what enterprise application logging looks like with logger.write. We'll take this out of the code because this was just illustrative. And that's all you've done. You've made a very simple change to the code to indicate I want to say hello from logging and have it written somewhere. How do we get it to go somewhere? That's the next thing we're going to cover.